welcome. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to Ross Douthat, his first visit to Thomas More College. We're delighted to have him host him here at the center and to hear from him this evening in our Fireside chat, Sans Fire, with President William Fahey. Most of you know President William Fahey, so I won't spend too much time introducing him. He is the third president of Thomas More College. On the Feast of St. George, just a couple weeks ago, he celebrated his 16th anniversary as president of Thomas More, so it's been a while. Most of you have been here before. The small number of you who may not have, the restroom is that door by our erstwhile photographer this evening, Michael Taylor. And also we'll have a little bit of time afterwards if you want to have some more desserts and conversation. Mr. Douthat has 5 children. The bio said 4. I didn't know about the 5th.
Neither did we until recently.
So I discovered...
We have to update that.
Yes, several things that we have in common. We're both involved with the Institute for Human Ecology. We both have the same kind of minivan. So, actually, I learned that you have 2 of them. So, but you know, I was looking over my emails and I invited Ross Douthat. Actually, when I did a search of my email that said Ross Douthat, I saw that it had been since 2000 that we'd been hoping to invite him to Thomas More College. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But in December, I reached out to him after reading his memoir of his experience with Lyme disease called The Deep Places. And we have had a number of children, some with varying degrees of severity, suffering through Lyme. And so I thought it would be good for him to come and share his experiences suffering for a number of years. And I know that's not, you know, a crowd pleaser topic, but it was an incredibly moving book for me, both from the standpoint of having, you know, several people whom I know and many people in our community who have struggled with not only Lyme, but a host of other kind of chronic health conditions, autoimmune conditions. It was just a very beautiful book. Beautiful moment in the book was, you know, at one point he said, you know, many people say, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You know, the realization is what doesn't kill you doesn't kill you. So, and that's a good place to start. And you know, it was very human. But when I contacted him, he was more than willing to come and speak on that, but said he had a new book coming out, which I didn't know about. So then I started reading about that book, and I thought, well, maybe he can come and talk about Believe, why everyone should be religious. And then I thought, well, he's written a book on Harvard. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now in higher education, and Harvard in particular. Well, he's written on the Holy Father, and that might be really interesting too. Oh, he's written on, and it occurred to me that maybe a fireside chat in which he could talk about a number of things. And then it also occurred to me that this is the kind of plight of a very successful journalist. I actually, right before this event, looked up the etymology of the word pundit. Because, you know, I think most of us, when we think of pundit, have a somewhat pejorative idea in our heads of someone who just...
Oh, yes.
talks about everything without having any knowledge whatsoever. Do you know the origin of the word pundit? The etymological?
Doesn't it come from pandit, South Asian term
would.
for a... Well, actually, the head of one of our children's schools is actually named Arti Pandit, and she's literally, yeah. So, but does it mean a wise person or wise?
It actually does.
It does.
Yes.
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 So,
So,
There you have it.
So there you go.
I passed the test.
I don't need etymology.com. I have him here with us this evening. So it occurred to me. So the biography I sent you all mentioned that a recent commentator likened Mr. Douthat to our modern day C.S. Lewis, and some of you. Or maybe he finds that a daunting and rather humbling comparison. But I actually, when I started thinking about his career, what he does, what he's written on, what he knows, I thought of St. Paul. So I'm going to up the front porch Republic one and say, I have become all things to all people. And if you think about it, that's sort of at the base what a pundit or a journalist is. They sometimes irritatingly seem to be the experts on all things for all people. But I think Mr. Douthat embodies exactly what St. Paul is saying. So I have become all things to all people so that I may save some. So I'm very grateful to have him here this evening. I'm grateful to all of you for coming to this event, and I look forward to the conversation.
I woke up at 2 a.m. with a sore throat. And my wife very kindly made me tea and lured me into this belief that everything was great. And then when I actually emerged, her first question was, "So are you prepared for the questions this evening?" And when I explained what I wanted to do, it wasn't what she wanted to do. So I apologize if I do not ask leading questions that you are interested in, but hopefully I will ask questions that you will discover an interest in. Since you are a pundit, I would like to start with a poem. And I'll be curious to know if you know this poem.
Thank God I knew what
Harvard
meant.
Educated and all. So, that's not the reason he might know the poem. But I only discovered this poem this morning, and I quite like it. The sea is forever quivering. The shore is forever still. And the boy who is born in a seacoast town is born with a dual will. The sand and the rocks and the beaches inveigle him to stay, while every wave that breaches is a nudge to be up and away. You know this poem?
Is that Wilbert Snow?
That is correct.
No, it's not. It's anyway.
So, yeah, Charles Wilbert Snow.
Charles Wilbert Snow is my great-grandfather,
That's great.
who was a kind of great American character, a Wesleyan professor who was born in a lighthouse off the coast of Maine, was a reindeer agent in Alaska. I don't even know what a reindeer agent is. I just like to say it. And he was a friend of Robert Frost, one tier down in terms of poetic skill, though that is a lovely poem. But Robert Frost is remembered. But Frost and Snow, two good New England poets. And crucially, I hope I'm not preempting the question, but he was governor of Connecticut for, I think, 12 to 14 days, because he was lieutenant governor, ran for governor and lost, but the governor ran for Senate and won. So governor resigns, goes to D.C., and Charles Wilbert Snow's portrait hangs in the governor's mansion in Hartford, Connecticut, because of those 14 days. And one day, we will have it back.
So here's that's great, and I'm delighted actually that you recognize the.
I mean, there are many of his poems that you could have quoted, but I would not. have recognized.
So I was delighted to discover him. Now here's my question using that poem as our vehicle. So I love this image of what he's expressing there, the boy with the dual will who's torn to stay on the land or the call of the sea. So I want to open, I'm always intrigued by those who have the vocation of being writers, or seem to have the vocation of being, right? You describe you don't use the word vocation, you talk about becoming a journalist. So the first question is, do you sympathize with the conflict in the boy here? Was there a struggle in your will, or did you always know, I'm destined to be a pundit?
I think, so I do sympathize with that struggle, but maybe not precisely, well, maybe in the way that you mean. I guess I would see sort of two conflicts, two internal conflicts in my own life that both relate to that image. And in fact, if you go online and buy a very used copy of Wilbert Snow's autobiography, you'll find a similar image where he's talking about the island that he was born on off the coast of Maine and how it has two sides, and one side faces the wild sea and one side is sort of warmer and landward, and that, you know, he sort of has a similar device of his own childhood self as being divided between these two perspectives. And I think, yeah, there's sort of two ways to think about that division in my own life. One is a divide in what kind of writer I am or became or have ended up being. I grew up in a house with two parents who were both aspiring writers who were not successful as writers when I was a kid, but both of them wanted to be writers of fiction. My dad sent short stories to the New Yorker and got rejection letters. My mother was trying to write a kind of great American novel about her fascinating New England family. And so I had the idea of the novelist as like the core writerly vocation, and the journalist was somewhere, you know, a few steps down. And once you got to pundit, obviously, you were at the bottom. And so I've always had, I've made this joke maybe to more than one of you tonight because some people have asked about my self-published fantasy novel, God help me. But there's a line that every political journalist is either a failed politician or a failed novelist, right? And so there is a sense in which, as a political journalist, as someone whose job is, I think that's right, to be all things to all people in certain ways, to be able to talk in a sort of shallow but informed sounding way about any topic that comes over the transom. There are times when I feel like I have not gone as deep into writing as, you know, the image of the writer's life that I carried as a child growing up would have suggested, right? That there is some sort of worldly superficiality to punditry that doesn't attach to the great American novel. Is that fair or true? I don't know, maybe not, right? I grew up, you know, the mention, C.S. Lewis is a bad example because Lewis was not a pundit. Lewis was a man of incredible depth whose sort of pundit-ish forays were always rooted in this incredible depth of knowledge. But someone like G.K. Chesterton, on the other hand, is, I think, a good example of someone who was a journalist, right? Who wrote some brilliant fiction, but it was short fiction. It was sort of, you know, I will confess that I can concede the brilliance of the man who was Thursday without necessarily loving it fully. I love the Father Brown stories, right? But Chesterton is sort of, he's the puppet, right? And Chesterton was incredibly important to me growing up and has been important to generations of Catholic and Christian and non-Christian writers and so on. So obviously there's great honor and dignity in journalism as well as in novel writing. The other place, though, and this maybe connects to the book that I wrote about Lyme disease, the other place where I sort of have felt that duality is, you know, I grew up and I was the child of parents who went to Yale and Stanford and who both sort of dropped out of the meritocracy to some degree. And I was, there was always a sort of suspicion of the world and worldly success on both sides of my family tree. Some of it sour grapes, right? But I always carried some of that with me, and I always carried, especially when I lived in Washington, D.C., this sort of romantic idea that I was doing this for now, I was in the nation's capital for now, I was in Babylon for now, but eventually I would retreat to some rural landscape, perhaps not unlike the environs of Thomas More College, and lead a more civilized intellectual life far from the temptations of power and the need to write about politics all the time. And when I was about 35, my wife and I actually did a version of that. We bought a farmhouse in Ridgefield, Connecticut, which is, close enough to New York City to get in on a train, but certainly not in the metropolis. And it had a barn, and it had fields, and a guest house. It had all of the things that in my romantic conception of myself would have fit. And I immediately became deathly sick with a tick-borne illness. And we spent 2 years trying to hack it in that rural environment and totally failed and abandoned the rural life, moved to New Haven, which is where I had grown up, I would never have imagined myself settling there in the end. And, again, I didn't go back to DC, but I went back to the kind of life that I had been trying to escape in a way. And I sort of accepted in a providential spirit that God was saying that impulse that I had was not the correct impulse to follow.
So I want to come to the deep places in a bit, but moving towards that, earlier you were speaking with our students, and one of the things that you said to those who aspire to write was something along the lines of many people imagine themselves being a writer. And that can be deadly if that's not followed by immersing yourself in the sort of regular discipline and habit and refining the arts of writing. So I now have two questions related to that. The first one, since you've already introduced your expedition into Lyme, was that voyage into the countryside moving away from the reality of the hard work of being a writer to an illusion? Because that's almost what you're implying now, or not. Because the writing, I mean, we're breaking from my preconceived order, and that's good, because it's a fireside chat. I mean, the writing, in my rapid review of your writing, which is very shallow, but might have the advantage of seeing moments, right? The writing in Deep Places is really beautiful. There you are in the countryside suffering. So was that a movement to an illusion of tranquility, or were you still able to maintain the hard discipline of writing, even during that period of suffering?
I was able to maintain the discipline of writing during that period, although the book itself was only written after we had left the farmhouse, and I had not recovered, but recovered sufficiently to be able to sort of have some distance and write about it from a place where it would not just be a kind of purely emotional howl. But yes, I don't think the retreat was a retreat from the discipline of writing per se. It was more a retreat from the kind of engagement with the world that the pundit, again, to stick with the theme of punditry, that the pundit has to do, right? That, like, there are ways in which, and I'm not going to say this is true of everyone, there are people who write about politics very effectively from the wilderness of Montana or the Berkshires or wherever else. But at least for me, I think it turned out that I was just not supposed to be as separate from the things that I was supposed to be writing about, the world, basically, the world of politics and Washington, D.C. and everything else, and the world of sort of, the world of the northeastern elite, as I had imagined. But no, the discipline of writing, was in a way the only thing I actually maintained successfully in the worst period of suffering. My marriage suffered, my everyday life was a wasteland, but I could still write a newspaper column. Which reflects, I mean, something, part of what I said to the students was that it is true that there is a deep aesthetic and creative element in writing, but part of writing, especially writing of the kind I do, does also bear some resemblance to fixing a toilet, right? Like there is a tradesman's aspect to producing an 800-word column on a consistent schedule that, again, I think is useful for people who are not writers or contemplating being writers to be aware of, that whatever you feel, the feeling, the feeling of almost quasi-divine creativity that can come with writing is entirely real, but it's also a trade and will remain a trade as long as you are actually doing it for a living and doing it consistently.
Would you just give us just a little bit more on the plumbing or the trade aspect? So when you write, I'm always fascinated in writers. I enjoy writing. I am not a writer, largely because I'm too old in a way to have the ability of sitting down every day and doing something. It's just not my set of habits. What are your set of habits? What makes you a writer? What does the trade of writing look like? And this would be helpful for me to know. I'm sure there are people here who aspire to some writing or engage in writing, but quite a number of our students are interested in writing. And I'm not a writer, but I try to make a similar point. What's his name? Malcolm Gladwell, whatever. He talks about literally the thousands of hours in anything that you must put in to do well. For some reason, writers are exempt from that, and there's this mystique that the bottle will bring them the glory of writing, not thousands. No, I'm not implying that. But
no, I'm always amazed. People do. I was never able to write.
What is the discipline of writing for you? When did it emerge? Would you get up to 800 words a day? Robert Royal once, within 30 seconds, trotted out how he's pulled off the Catholic thing, and it's utterly formulaic. He's a wonderful writer, but then you hear him on the craft of writing, and it literally is, I get up every day at this hour, I have to put in 2 hours of work, I have this word count, and this is how I come out with a book every other year.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. I mean, some of it, so there's a couple things, right? I don't have a really precise, 9, 10 a.m. I sit down here, and by 10:47 I've done that, and so on, in part because my schedule is just more hectic and chaotic than that. I travel a fair amount, we have a lot of kids, and each day is quite different, right? It's more that, especially the presence of kids kind of enforces discipline. So if you were to really scrutinize my writing productivity over the course of the last 20 years, you would notice a sharp break at the point when we had our first child, where I became much more productive, even though I technically had substantially less time to write. So that's one thing. There's just a forcing mechanism of, you have to produce X number of words, and guess what? You have 2 hours until you have to relieve your wife or the babysitter or pick someone up from school, and you know this. So that's one thing. But then, there is a kind of constructive element in a lot of the kind of writing that I do. So I can just take the example of the piece that I just filed, that is now available on the New York Times website. So you need an idea, and the idea does have to come to you. I mean, you can force it, but it's always better when you haven't forced it, when it's something that's organically there. So in this case, I was watching a new cable or streaming TV show called Your Friends and Neighbors that stars John Hamm, who was the star of Mad Men, and he is once again playing a sort of unhappy Connecticut rich guy, but this time it's the present day, and he's a hedge funder, and he loses his job, and various things happen, and he ends up turning to stealing from his wealthy neighbors' mansions. So that's the show. And it's not a great show at all, but we watched a couple of episodes, and I was struck by how miserable the show makes being rich seem. And there are many shows in a way that make being rich seem miserable, but usually there's still an element of aspiration involved, where you're like, okay, these people are miserable, but still you can see how nice there, you watch The White Lotus and you're like, well, I'd like to be at that resort. Come on, right? Even if the people are miserable. So it was really striking to me just how the absence of aspiration in this show. So that's the idea, right? That's the beginning of a column. And so you start with that idea and you say some things like, usually TV does this, but this show does that. And then you have to go somewhere with that. And you have to say, so in this case, it was like, all right, should we think this is a good point? If it is a good point, is it a new point? Has being rich become more miserable than it used to be? Like the characters, is this an accurate portrait of a changing reality? So then you need a structure. So you say, okay, here are 3 ways. It's always good to have 3, right? 3 ways that maybe being rich is less fun than it used to be. The pressures of meritocracy, everyone cares if your kids go to the Ivy League in a way that, they can't just coast in the way JFK coasted into Harvard or something. And that, whatever, right? There's one example. Then you have 2 more. So then that's 2/3 of the piece. Initial idea, explanation of why the show might be onto something, and then some complicating twist or turn at the end. And I didn't come up with a great one. I just said, well, here are some reasons why this show still falls short, because it makes it over-eggs its pudding. It makes it seem too awful, and you can actually think to yourself of reasons why, if I were rich, I would be happier than these people, right? So there you have it. That's the piece, and there's some creative impulse or insight there to begin with. Which is why it's good as a writer to have things to react to read books, to watch television shows, to commune with the culture, because you're looking for some kind of reaction. But then you structure it, and it's not quite a toilet, right? But it is a thing that you are building that has something creative at the center, but you're structuring around it. And then you file it, and it's published. And then you need to write something else.
So all continuous hard work of a sort.
Of a sort.
Yeah.
But also, I'm incredibly lucky that I can sit on the couch at night after getting our kids to bed, watch a random Apple TV show, and come up with the idea for what I'm going to do for work the next day. That is an incredible grace.
So I want to shift to Harvard and your early book, Privilege, which 20 years ago you wrote this book. And there was a section in there that struck me about hard work. I don't know if you remember the section where you talk about Harvard teaching you hard work, or as a place where you encountered hard work. And you had just finished talking about Harvard as sort of windswept devastation when it comes to the faculty, the academic life, certain things that people associate with the glory of Harvard. And then you say something like, there was considerable hard work at Harvard. And then you have a list. Hard work of networking, the hard work of learning about elite culture, its sort of etiquette, its maneuvers, etc. And your conclusion is the one thing that wasn't hard at Harvard was the academics. You then move to a conclusion about yourself, because you say you loved Harvard and that there were great people at Harvard. There were fine courses at Harvard. In that criticism, it was a sort of negative moment. But you end with this comment that it's in the chapter, The Days After. You express your reflection on your Harvard education, your love for Harvard, but you find that Harvard was a place of unrequited dreams, and that you're still torn between 2 poles. One is a real and lively Catholic faith, but also a strong sense of worldliness, that this was kind of seared on you by Harvard. That was 20 years ago. So my question is, what does the Ross Douthat of 2025 say to the Ross Douthat of 2005? Was his assessment correct of a Harvard education? Has your life confirmed what you observed then? Has it gotten any better? Has it gotten worse?
I think it's gotten worse. So one thing I would say to my younger self, right? Besides some advice to buy NVIDIA. No, sorry. There's that worldliness. Is that I think the diagnosis of what ailed the meritocracy in that era was correct. And in fact, I think after I wrote the book, it was sort of developed and amplified by a lot of other writers who, maybe sometimes did a better job than I did. But just, there was a book by William Deresiewicz called Excellent Sheep that came out maybe 10 years ago now that was sort of, and there have been a number of these books, right, sort of making versions of this case that meritocracy teaches sort of a certain kind of ambitious conformism that is sort of not really about the life of the mind. But my sense of how college and elite college has changed since then, and especially in the last 5 to 10 years, right, is that there still was a kind of, the hard work that I was talking about critically in the book was still actual hard work, right? And there was, our grades were inflated, but you would have been embarrassed not to turn in an assignment. Maybe you would have figured out a clever way to turn it in at 5 a.m. when it had actually been due at 5 p.m. Like, we put a lot of effort into gaming the system and all these kinds of things. But in the end, you would do the assignment, right? And you would expect a B plus or an A minus, even if it was B or B minus work. But you would have actually done it, right? And there was, I think, in that culture, a strong expectation of personal discipline, I would say, a certain kind of personal discipline, again, that was more dedicated towards ambition and advancement than learning, but was still a present and powerful force. And I think my sense, and maybe it's gotten better in the last year or two, it's certainly reached a kind of nadir in the aftermath of COVID, is that a bunch of that has dissolved, right? And so there is still ambition, but it's ambition joined to there's a kind of mental health crisis, right, that hangs over elite academic life that was absent in my day, and that is sort of a novelty, right, relative to that world. So maybe that's sort of a dark thing to say, right, but that there are sort of worse things than hyper-ambitious meritocrats. There are hyper-ambitious meritocrats who are deeply depressed and incapable of finishing an assignment and expect their teachers to forgive them endlessly even if they never show up to class. I think that change is real and is a change for the worse. The other thing I might say is that while my 25-year-old or whatever self was right in a way to worry about the moral effect of a Harvard education, I do think it made me worldlier and more ambitious than I had been before in ways that were not fully compatible with my Christian faith. I would say reassuringly, that if you make serious choices in life, that, certain forms of your ego will be disciplined in various ways. Like if you embark on a serious adulthood and do things like get married and have kids and make a set of choices that are not solely dictated by self-interest, then necessity and obligation and all of those unavoidable reality, all of those powerful forces will shape you as much as your ambitions do. So I feel maybe better about the long-run effect of Harvard on my character now than I did as a sort of ambitious 20-something who hadn't suffered very much in life. I mean, that's the thing about life. It does deliver suffering in appropriate doses, even if you're very successful.
Well, okay, this is a nice segue because I want to move from Harvard to zooming decades forward to deep places and talk about your journey into Lyme, or Lyme, its journey into you in the way you describe it. And just in hearing you, my hunch was, for all your harsh assessment of Harvard, even those things that were not the curriculum, struck me that those were preparatory for some of the difficulties that came later in life. So undergraduates are often criticized, especially these days, for being coddled or not being resilient. And maybe it was the things that followed. But in reading through the deep places, I wondered if some of those other things about Harvard helped prepare you in a way for navigating suffering. And your particular experience that you describe in the book in navigating all the different competing medical philosophies and ways of looking at the human. That requires a lot of skill. Most people don't have the resolve to do that. They cave in to an authority.
Yeah, and I would say this, that is another place where I do think the landscape of elite education has changed somewhat. I didn't feel like we were coddled at Harvard. I felt like we were failed in various ways. We were not given an adequate moral or metaphysical horizon. But I didn't feel like we were sort of helicopter parented or anything by the school or institutions in the way that, again, some people think students are today. So yeah, Harvard taught me to be, it's sort of a horrible word to use, but it taught me to be agentic, right? To think of yourself as someone who has certain capacities to which the world will respond and bend and yield with sufficient effort. And if I was going to describe, if I was going to give advice on how to get through not just an illness, but a mystery illness where something is wrong with you that the average doctor can't help you with and can't figure out, I would say that you need a combination of endurance, where in that territory, I would say it was Christianity and religious faith that supplied the most to me, but also agentic activity, right? A sense of like, you're not just going to endure, you are also going to try to get better. And you're going to try, and you're going to try again, and you're going to see a different doctor, and a doctor after that, and you're going to educate yourself on the disease. You're going to do your own research, which is a phrase that, a certain disrepute attaches to that phrase for some good reason. People who do their own research on the internet often come to crackpot conclusions. That's true. But when you are confronted with a situation where official knowledge isn't giving you anything, being able to do your own research is in some ways the only way you can save your life, right? So it wasn't Harvard alone, probably, that taught me how to do that. But yes, I think there were elements of being given an elite education and feeling like, hey, you are someone in the world. You can navigate the world and figure some things out, and the world will respond to you if you push at it. That was very, very useful and necessary, because endurance alone, if you don't get better, endurance can run out, right? You need endurance and you need hope. And Christianity supplies cosmic hope, but you need nearer term forms of hope as well. And I found those through exercising my faculties and working to get better.
Did the years of, the particular years described in the book of suffering with Lyme, set the stage for believe? Did suffering prompt a deeper meditation, or no? And the reason I ask is, with our seniors at the college, we've just finished a course where part of the course is they spend a considerable amount of time reading non-Western classics. So they've gone through the Upanishads, the Dhammapada, the Analects, and one of the things that I appreciate about your approach and belief is you use history and culture as an argument for the rationality of belief by saying, look, I'm not going to make an argument as a Catholic or even as a Christian. Let's just start by saying it's reasonable when we look at the cultures. And it made me think in particular of Buddhism, which of all the non-Christian religions, I think dwells most on the implications of suffering in life. I mean, the noble truths of Buddha are really nothing more than a meditation on the universality of suffering, and is there a way for the human to move towards something transcendent and escape from suffering? And that as I've actually been listening to you read me Believe. We were talking earlier at dinner about the shift in the United States to a literary written print culture, to a culture that increasingly wants to see and listen to things, even substantial things, hence the growth. I think most of us in this room enjoy podcasts and audible books and so forth. So I actually haven't had the leisure time with my eyes to go through this book, but my commute into work has been you for the last couple weeks reading to me the morning reading of Believe with Ross Douthat. And I must say, I love it when authors read their own books when they can read well. So it's a delight listening to that book. But the meditation on suffering, on world religions got me thinking, did the one book encourage the other? Is Believe the fruit of a period of dwelling upon suffering, what gets you through your faith in a particular way?
Yeah, I mean, clearly they are connected to one another, right? In that I wrote one and then the other. They follow. They follow. They follow sequentially. I think if you were just treating them argumentatively, right, they are quite different in that Believe is trying to make a kind of almost an impersonal argument for religion. It's sort of saying, like, look at the world as a scientist, as a philosopher, as a sociologist. Look at religious experience the way William James looked at it, right? Like, look at the universe the way Newton looked at it. These kind of that kind of perspective, right? And arguing that kind of perspective yields a form of religious belief. Since I've been compared to St. Paul, I'll say that the book is it's a bit of an exposition on Paul's comment in, I think, the letter to the Romans, right, where he says basically, okay, I'm here with the revelation, but even before the revelation, there were all these signs and indicators, and you should have known. So this is a book about those signs and indicators, what you should have known before the revelation showed up. What does St. Paul mean in a 21st century context with the base of knowledge we have now? And that's different from the Deep Places. The Deep Places has a bunch of weirdo, some weirdish, some very weird stuff that isn't spiritual and religious, but also some weird stuff that is, but is very personal and experiential. And I wouldn't expect anyone reading the Deep Places to take it as an argument for the existence of God, because I think a skeptical or agnostic or atheistic reader would just say, here we have yet another case study in someone who needed to believe in God because of how much he was suffering, needed that crutch. And the book very explicitly says, yes, it's a crutch, and I needed it. And it doesn't prove that God was real. It just proves that I had this powerful need, and it helped carry me through the experience. But I think the strongest, so they are different kinds of arguments. I think the strongest link between them at a personal level, at the level of like my own psychology, is that going through the experience of Lyme disease definitely increased my fundamental impatience with atheism to a point where I was maybe ready to write a book whose main theme is that, atheism is ridiculous.
Well,
right?
This comes out. So
Yeah.
this is, I was not implying, if you haven't read Believe, that it's at all religion as a crutch or a sop.
Believe is not.
It's not. In fact, this comes to my next question for you. It's called Believe. I'd like to know more about the choice of that. It's promoted as a book on religion, which it is, a defense of religion. I have not finished it. I've sort of gotten with you. You've taken me about 2/3 of the way through, and I skim the conclusion. So there are no spoilers. I know where you're heading. But it struck me that the book is as much, if not more, a defense of reason and reasonability. And your particular frustration with the reason-cloaking atheists of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s comes out strong. That Christopher Hitchens and company had a kind of aura of being the ones in the room who were rational, but they're not very rational. And so much of the book seems to be, in a way, as you were describing St. Paul, talking about those things that precede the moment of revelation, kind of clearing that area, the reasonability of what's coming. But in fact, it seems to be less about religion and more about the preconditions to consider religion. Is that an inaccurate? Have I misheard you during morning story hour with
No,
Ross?
I think it's so it obviously is about the preconditions to. It's about the preconditions to religious commitment, and it presumes that you're not going to fully argue someone into a relationship with God. It's not. It sort of takes for granted that the relationship with God is distinct from the process of reasoning about the universe. And that is sort of, in a way, a limit on how far it takes you. At the same time, and this is why I guess I called it Believe, I think reason takes you a bit further than just establishing that religion, that you should take religion seriously, right? I think reason takes you to the point where it's not just that the new atheists are simplistic or crude or bumptious or whatever else, right? It's that they're not describing the universe that we actually inhabit. And the major world religions clearly are, with different lenses and different perspectives and so on. But there is a commonality there that is getting at is getting at reality itself, I think. And part of that reality is the idea of that mind precedes matter, that there is purpose and intelligibility woven into the universe. Part of it is the reality that religious experience represents a real encounter with higher and perhaps lower powers separate from human beings, right? That's a bit more than just openness to religion, right? I feel like I feel like once I've carried the reader to the point of saying, you should probably take the existence of angels and demons seriously, I'm a little bit past the preconditions, and I'm into territory where a term like belief actually makes sense. Or at least that's partially the goal. And then, since, the ending is, there's there's sort of a rhetorical, I don't want to say a trick because I'm pretty open about it, but there's a rhetorical maneuver involved in what I'm doing, right? Where I'm defending the reasonability of religious belief in general, and then I'm ending by explaining why I think my specific belief in Catholic Christianity makes sense in the light of everything that I've described already. And so in that sense, the book, without explicitly saying that this is what it is doing, if it carries the reader along, by the end it just carried the reader all the way to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Or again, at least that's the goal, I think. So yes, at the very least, I'm trying to establish preconditions, but yeah, I'm trying to get a little further than that. Trying to get into the realm of there's probably a God, supernatural realms probably exist, you're almost certainly going to meet your maker when you die. How you, I mean, I don't know. These seem like stronger claims than just the preconditions, I guess.
Does it get beyond Pascal's wager? Because I did jump ahead, and you have an explicit section where you say, life is short, death is certain, and what account are you going to give to yourself if the believers turn out to have been right all along?
Yes, but I guess my difference, Pascal's wager is so often framed as, not even by Pascal himself, but just sort of in popular culture as, look, you're gambling on the eternal destiny of your soul. So even if it's a 1 in 1,000 chance that God exists, set against eternal possibilities, you should still take that bet, right? But therefore it's presented as saying, okay, the probabilities are against the existence of God, but you should bet on it anyway. I think that's sort of the conventional, in popular culture version of Pascal's wager. To the extent that I'm offering a version of Pascal's wager, I'm saying the odds are good. The odds are strong, right? You're not hoping a 1 in 100 bet pays off. In fact, it's the other way. I'm saying, that there's again, I don't actually assign these kind of percentages in the book, right? But I'm saying that I'm implying at the least that it's, reasonable to say there's a 97% chance that Daniel Dennett is wrong, right? And I think it's higher than that, right? And then there's, a 90% chance that the Abrahamic religions are right. And then, again, this is an incredibly crude way of putting it, but to the extent that I'm engaging in a version of that, I'm trying to convince the reader that that the wager is not a long shot bet. It is the bet that the rational person would make. I guess the rational person would make Pascal's the 1 in 1,000 bet too. But it is the odds are on the side of the believer. It's not a bet against the odds with the hope of some eternal payoff.
My better half is signaling, but I don't have glasses, so I can't see what she's saying. So we're getting close, are we? I have more questions. One more. I haven't even got to film yet. We haven't talked about the conclave or the New York Times. Well, maybe
I bet someone will ask about.
Someone will ask us. So no one. I've never heard of anyone really asking you. They probably do, but I'd like to. Since I'm only allotted one more question, I was struck by something you said in your article in the New York Times. We aren't just watching the decline of the Oscars, but the end of movies, in which you make the following statement. I'll read two statements. What looks finished in the movies, folks, what looks finished in the movies, big screen entertainment, as Central American popular art form, the key engine of American celebrity, the main aspirational space of American actors and storytellers, a popular culture church with its own icons and scriptures and rites of adult initiation, that seems to be disappearing. Now, part of me thinks, hooray, that that's disappearing, although I love true old classic cinema. But at the very end, when you propose restoration and preservation, you say this, an emphasis, how do we restore classic cinema? How do we restore classic cinema? An emphasis on making the encounter with great cinema a part of a liberal arts education. This is what you propose. Since the liberal arts are themselves in crisis, this may sound...
Not here, elsewhere.
This may sound a bit like suggesting we add a wing to a burning house. But you seriously propose that perhaps in a standard undergraduate liberal arts education, that film be seriously considered. Can you walk through, not the argument for that, but what would that look like? You actually do talk a little bit about that in the Harvard book too, but walk us through that. That'll be my last question before we open it up. Because that's a side view I don't think everyone's gotten a chance to see.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that obviously it would depend on the design of an overall curriculum. But if I were charged with designing a kind of, general education in the liberal arts for a citizen of the United States of America, I would say that just as we take for granted, or should, that such a person might be assigned, The Great Gatsby and Moby Dick and, three or four other such great American novels that every American should read, it would make sense to take for granted that at some point in your education there would be, 5, 10, 15 movies that you would see and maybe read a critical essay on, maybe react to. I think, different teachers will have different approaches. In the book on Harvard, I talked about a course I took in college called Concept of the Hero in Greek Civilization. That was a kind of survey course on ancient Greek literature, but organized around the particular idea of the heroic. And the teacher, the professor, assigned Blade Runner and assigned the documentary When We Were Kings about Muhammad Ali, and a couple other movies that I can't remember. But then he made kind of vivid links between, the portrait of the tragic mortality of the androids in Blade Runner and the ancient Greek view of mortality in battle and these kind of things. I'm forgetting the details, right? It was a long time ago. That would be the more creative version. Like, a great teacher would be able to integrate cinema into teaching of the classics or teaching of the American classics. But just at a baseline level, right? Should Americans, there are movies that I never saw. I write about movies, but I didn't have an education in film, right? So I saw Singing in the Rain for the first time when I showed it to my kids, right? There's a bunch of movies like that I should have seen as someone who writes about the movies and have only seen later in life for various reasons. I think, especially when I talk to younger audiences now, that, people our age and older tend to just assume that, people have seen the movies because that's a popular art form, and but in fact, they haven't seen the movies, and the movies can disappear just as surely as literature can disappear. And the movies are beautiful and amazing and an essential part of the American patrimony, and are a bridge, because they are the most modern of the popular art forms. They are a bridge. You can go through the movies back to literary classics and beyond, again, with the right teacher in the right context, right? There are links between the best of American cinema and the traditions of literature and drama and everything else that the liberal arts is trying to preserve. So yeah, I don't have a, here are the 5 movies that every American must see, but I think seeing that transmission as part of an education in the arts of the American experience would be a valuable thing.
Do we want to move the mic?
So whoever has a question, I'll just hand you the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I would be interested in your comment about how the coming world of AI may be devastating to your particular profession and to our
my
ability as
profession.
readers. Our ability as readers to actually determine what is real and what is not real. How many of your counterparts at the New York Times or others are using AI already to write their pieces, or how is this going to affect our reality and the creativity of humanity and that type of thing?
Yeah, how is it going to affect it? Probably not for the better. I think that there are places where one could be optimistic about AI's potential effects. Like if AI helps us figure out cures for cancer and, how to develop cheaper sources of energy, you can make a long list of things where the AI that is prophesied could yield real benefits to human beings, but I think in the realm of humanism and the arts, it's very hard to see a truly optimistic path. I think what you are likely to get in certain ways is a kind of AI convergence, where the AI writes more and more like human beings, and the human beings write more and more like AI, and man and pig look at one another, and no one can tell like that's one way of thinking about it. I am skeptical at some level, and maybe this is just being naive about the future, but I am skeptical at some level that you can have full replacement of human creativity. That, you know, to take the example of the movies, right? Like, one of the most powerful things about the movies is the people's identifications with movie stars, right? People don't just go to the movies to see a story. They go to see a story enacted by particular people who exist in the real world and exist in the world of the story. And that dualism has this sort of particular kind of power, right? Does a movie filled with AI-generated actors who don't exist in the real world have the same pull and appeal? I like to think that it doesn't. That may be naivete. Same thing with my own profession, right? Like, I do think that part of the appeal of the newspaper columns to people is the sense that they aren't just reading thoughts, they are having an encounter with an actual human being who has those thoughts and exists like them in the world. And so an AI that could generate simulacra of Ross Douthat columns might not, might still not have the same purchase on readers. Yeah, that would be the optimistic narrative. The pessimistic narrative is you could rear a generation that just sort of sees no distinction and regards everything as everything is interchangeable entertainment. You're being entertained as long as the entertainment hits a particular level of complexity. It doesn't have to hit that high level of complexity. You'll be there for it, and you won't care about whether there's a person behind it, or you will be educated into the belief that the AIs are as real as you and me, right? And that's another scenario, right, which already exists to some degree. People have AI boyfriends and AI friends and so on, and the more you are in that world, the more the AI actor or the AI columnist doesn't seem like a big leap. So that would be the pessimistic spin. I think that what matters above all in this kind of environment is developing strategies of mastery over technology. I do not think that on any plausible time horizon we are going to regulate our way out of the AI future. I think it is, there are regulations and there are educational policies and all kinds of things that can help. But in the end, there's going to be a kind of cultural selection process where institutions, perhaps institutions like this one, that figure out how to remain human and use technologies in ways that serve human beings rather than the other way around, are the ones that will flourish over a long time horizon. And the peoples and cultures that give in fully to the artificial will fail to reproduce themselves and disappear. So that's sort of a blend of pessimism and optimism, right? That there's going to be a great cull, but something's going to be there on the other side, and the thing that's there on the other side is going to be resilient against what AI does or potentially does to human culture and human societies, right? That, like, the way we're going to find out how to survive is to see what survives, right? And I'm being a good Darwinist, right? But I do think there's an insight there, right? That selection pressures are powerful, and if we're lucky, the next 60 years are going to select for human resilience against AI, and the use of AI as a servant rather than a master. And yeah, nations, peoples, families, institutions that aren't resilient won't be there in the year of our Lord 2125. But we'll see.
Hi, thank you. So to go back to the movie thought about incorporating that into education, Hollywood being on one side and then the creative thoughts being on the other, call it conservative media has been thought of as kind of universally terrible. So one of the debates that I'm fascinated to see play out in that space right now is whether you're building new institutions or trying to reform the existing ones. So how do you think about that in terms of incorporating cinema or art in a certain, we'll call it Christian milieu, if I have that word correct. Yeah. And kind of regaining that animating spirit to be able to compete with a Hollywood, assuming you're going to try to build Hollywood 2.0.
Yeah, so two separate things. So one, you need, essentially, you need Christians and conservatives to see themselves as the custodians of the fullness of the Western cultural tradition. And this is something that I think at its best, classical education and great books education does really well. I think it can probably do more and sort of expand its ambit further, again, to encompass the movies, right? But I think one of the failures of conservative and religious art in the last 50 or 60 years has been this sense that it's doing something very narrow and sectarian and doctrinaire, sometimes under religious motivations, sometimes under ideological motivations, that is trying to make the conservative alternative to whatever Hollywood is doing and so on. And the reality is that Hollywood at its best, despite being run by liberals and having liberal politics, has always made plenty of movies that have conservative themes and conservative impulses and conservative ideas in them because they're works of art that are trying to capture the fullness of the world. And so that's the artistic mandate for would-be culture builders. You're trying to create art that is not primarily serving ideological ends, but is primarily about capturing the fullness of reality. And to the extent that conservatives can do that, they can effectively take over stewardship of the culture from liberals. But you have to have that sense of fullness. On the institutions question, I think the challenge for the right, writ large in America right now, is it's not even a debate about should we build new institutions or should we take over old institutions. There's just a lot of money on the right now, much of it coming from Silicon Valley, that just doesn't have any theory of institutions at all, right? Like this is, I think, one of the big weaknesses of, a lot of tech money that used to be left-wing and now, in reaction to wokeness and everything else, is more right-wing, but still imagines that, like, well, to take the example from the last question, that, like, why would you need to set up new universities when everyone will have an AI tutor soon, right? Like if you had Elon Musk up here and you said, Elon, you're a gazillionaire, why don't you, found 6 new universities tomorrow? If you hate the woke mind virus, okay, fine. Why don't you found 6 new unwoke universities and give them all each $1 billion endowment? And I think Musk and many people in his world have the natural sense that, like, we're in a post-institutional world, and everything is going to be, well, I think Musk would say eventually you'll have a Neuralink implant that will deliver Cicero and Xenophon direct to your cerebral cortex or something. But that I think is a big, like, a lot of money that has sort of moved rightward in the last 10 years still lacks even a theory of why it should be either trying to build new institutions or taking over old ones. And I think you really need a donor class. Like, I mean, here we are sitting in a Gilded Age mansion, and whatever you might say about the Gilded Age, gazillionaires, they believed in institutions and they built them, and they were artistic and they were academic. Some of them were religious, and they lasted and shaped America. And I don't look around at even the money that is sort of on my side in American politics and see that same kind of sensibility, and it's a problem.
Question for you. In your book, you discuss a development of the last 50 years or so where science, not just faith, science, biology, chemistry, so forth, physics, have shown a tremendous fitness of the universe, of life for us. And one example you give is which we discussed briefly earlier, is the balance between dark energy and gravity in the universe. And this balance is so fine, it's unimaginably fine. And scientists themselves were shocked to discover how fine this was. And you discuss other examples like this, how the universe, there seems to be a primordial mind behind all of these perfect coincidences. They can't be described in some other way. They can't be just coincidences. They can't just be accidents. And you quote one author who is a professor at NYU, who wrote a book with the subtitle related to this, Why the Darwinian Materialist Conception of Evolution is Almost Certainly Wrong. And so you bring in this whole world of science in the last 50 years, which a lot of people don't know about. They don't know how science is moving in a direction that says this can't all be a mistake or an accident or a coincidence. And that what at NYU you quoted has been branded by his colleagues as a traitor, as a violating their materialist faith. And I'm wondering what kind of pushback you've gotten with respect to your marshaling this evidence.
Surprisingly little pushback. So that, I mean, you know, I obviously I haven't staged many, I've done one big debate, but I haven't done the kind of Hitchens thing of going around the country doing debates and so on, right? I'm sure that I could find plenty of good materialist atheist scientists who would dispute my use of some of the scientific evidence you described. But what's been striking to me is I've done a lot of events and gone on a lot of podcasts, as one does, with people who are not Christians, not religious believers of any kind. And time and again, they sort of concede a version of your point, right? Like I have a friend who's a geneticist in Texas, and I did his podcast, and he describes himself as an atheist, but he said, yeah, look, obviously the multiverse, which is one of the theories, you know, advanced to explain fine-tuning. He's like the multiverse is cope, right? It's like, you know, even he is not going to defend the kind of hard materialism, the hard atheism that was more confidently championed 10 or 15 years ago. And again, like many, you know, I've had many interlocutors who will say, well, I can't get there with you on the supernatural, but I agree that consciousness presents a really hard problem to materialism that no one can solve, right? So I've actually been surprised at how much of kind of the liberal clerisy is in a state of agnosticism at the moment. They all have hurdles or impediments to becoming religious, to sort of going from this sort of general evidence for that something weird is going on, and getting from there to, like, one guy just doesn't want to use the word God, right? He's like, isn't the word God so limiting, right? Another person, as I said, doesn't want to believe in, you know, obviously the miraculous and the supernatural is a big hurdle for a lot of people. I did a long podcast with my colleague Ezra Klein, right? And he just wanted to argue back and forth about whether you could have any confidence in a specific religious tradition. But he has done, you know, psychedelics and had spiritual experiences and is convinced they're entirely real, right? So it's a weird world out there, and it's a very interesting landscape. But I think a lot of what you're doing when you enter into this landscape right now as a religious arguer is trying to figure out, person by person, case by case, okay, not you personally, right, but you as a hypothetical person, what is your particular reason for not being religious? And you end up encountering a lot of different reasons that vary with the person, and the argument that you offer to each person is then going to necessarily be somewhat different. So but it definitely doesn't feel to me like there's this really powerful edifice of scientific materialism that I'm just like waving a toothpick against. Quite the reverse.
Thank you, thank you.
I have a follow-up to that. I agree that there seems to be a growing group of people that are ready to turn to religion. My question is the church, the Catholic Church, in a state to receive them?
I would say not, I mean, not at the level of kind of hierarchical authority and power. But the fact that people are experiencing this openness at a time when the church as a hierarchical institution is weak, or seems weak and discredited, and, you know, everyone, pious, faithful Catholics are pretty disillusioned with the hierarchical church in different ways. Liberals are disillusioned, conservatives are disillusioned, everyone's disillusioned. If I want to be optimistic, maybe that's providential, right? It's like, okay, the people I know who are becoming Catholic right now are not reading papal encyclicals and sort of, you know, deciding that, you know, what's happening in Rome is central to their faith. They're showing up at Mass at their local parish. And at that level, you know, yeah, the church is short of priests and has, you know, plenty of problems, right? But the Mass is the Mass. You know, the Holy Spirit, the saints, all these things that Catholics believe are present there. If that's real, they are present, right? And I don't know, I to the extent that I see individual people coming into the Catholic Church, I feel like it's happening very much at a kind of ground level where what matters is the parish, the sacraments, maybe some kind of interaction with a local priest, but not some kind of engagement with whatever's happening in Rome, with whatever the hierarchy is saying. And look, that can't go on forever. At some point, you need to rebuild church authority. Catholicism is a hierarchical religion. It's bad to have the leaders of the church have their reputation in such disrepute. But yeah, I think that like revivals don't happen exactly the way pundits would draw them. Like a pundit's revival is a world where you elect a great pope, and he's a genius, and he writes an amazing encyclical, and everyone is like, that's it, signing up, right? And, you know, it's more organic. It's more organic than that. And I think there is at least the possibility of it happening even with sort of weakness and corruption and so on defining some important parts of the church. I don't know. That would be the hopeful case.
We have a final question. Is there anyone? Did you agree?
Okay, well, this has been wonderful, and I'm glad to have gotten to know you. And first time I've ever heard of you, sorry. But anyway.
Do not be sorry.
But I was picturing you doing the job that you're doing. You are going upstream. And how do you do that day in and day out? How do you encounter, like, how do you keep your balance as a Catholic in the circles that you run in? So just a personal question.
I mean, first of all, it's not always easy. And day by day, you might feel, you know, deeply underappreciated one day, resentful another day, that other writers have it easier and get to be surrounded by people who agree with them and these kind of things. And the next day, you know, you might write something and people demand that you're fired, and that get fired, and that can be exhausting. So I don't want to overstate how easy it is. It's not easy, but a couple things. One, like, it's a great blessing to be able to write for people who disagree with you, right? The writer wants to persuade. To the extent that, you know, my line of work is a high calling and actually close to being a novelist or something, you know, these things that I romanticized as a kid. What's high about it is you get a chance every time you write to change someone's mind, to show them the world in a new way. And most writers, generally, especially in a polarized world, are writing for people who already agree with them. And so there's only so much persuasion they can do. And so it's a real blessing to have a wider field of persuasion. There's lots of people who read my columns who think I'm totally full of it. And so every column is a new opportunity to tweak their sensibilities just a little bit, right? So that's a great thing. And then the other thing is that, and I said something like this to the students, or maybe I said it to someone afterward. I can't remember. But like most people, this is really useful to understand in a society that is officially divided, right from left, Trump from anti-Trump, all of these things, right? But most people, even now in the world, respond favorably to decency, kindness, generosity, like to the virtues. And I'm not here to tell you that I practice all of the virtues successfully, but I do think I have tried in my long career working for institutions and working with people who disagree with me strongly to treat people respectfully, to act grateful to be there, to not act resentful even when I feel resentful. Generally, I have been repaid for that behavior with good treatment, fair treatment, friendship, kindness, again, even from people who strongly disagree. Now, there are exceptions. There are people in every environment I move in who know what I write and know what I stand for and dislike me for it, but they are the minority. They are not the rule. And so I would just be, I take my general experience of moving back and forth between worlds of the right and worlds of the left, worlds of the religious and worlds of the non-religious, as a case for optimism about human beings. We're fallen and screwed up in a million different ways, but we are also interesting, fun, well-meaning, delightful, in liberal America and conservative America both. And, you know, if you go to other countries and then come back, you may find yourself realizing that in all of our divisions and so on, we do actually share a lot in common. And that too can be a worthwhile recognition that, you know, someone in my particular position can get to experience a lot of the time. So, you know, when I'm fired tomorrow, you can remember this naive optimism and laugh. But I think that's a good place. That's a good place to leave you. It's the world, and human beings are, you know, never as good as you might wish, but never as bad as they appear just from scrolling on your phone.